The North Atlantic wind, in the late 10th century, was a known entity. It was a brutal, cleansing force that had sculpted the sagas and sinews of the Norse people for generations. A force they had learned not just to endure but to harness. It filled the sails of their iconic longships, carrying them from the fjords of Norway to the settled shores of Iceland and onward to the stark, demanding coasts of Greenland. This wind represented a continuum, a thread connecting them to a familiar world of known perils and predictable struggles against winter, against the sea, against rival chieftains. But in the year 986, a different kind of story was blown off course. According to the sagas, a merchant vessel captained by a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson was driven far to the west in a thick fog, and when the mist cleared, he beheld a coastline that was not Greenland. It was a land of gentle, forested hills, a stark and profound contrast to the glacial realm Sinu. Bjarni, focused on his original mission, did not land. He turned his ship back into the wind, reporting his sighting as a curiosity, an anomaly on the edge of the known world. Yet his report planted a seed, one that would find fertile ground in the mind of a man named Leif Erikson, son of Erik the Red, the founder of Greenland's eastern settlement. For Leif, the son of an outlaw and a pioneer in his own right, the unknown was not a barrier but an invitation. Around the turn of the millennium, perhaps in the year 1000 or 1001, he purchased Bjarni's ship and retraced the accidental voyage with intention. The sagas describe a systematic exploration, a journey of geographical revelation. He first made landfall on a desolate shore of flat stone, which he named Helgeland, the land of flat stones, likely the modern Baffin Island. Sailing south, he encountered a coast lined with dense forest, which he called Markland, the land of forests. Generally agreed to be the Labrador coast, but it was his third landing that would pass from history into legend. Here, the sagas speak of a gentler place, where the grass remained green in winter, where salmon teemed in the rivers, and where the wild grapevines grew so plentifully that Leif named it Vinland. It was a name that evoked bounty, a promise of a new beginning far from the resource-scarce margins of Greenland. This was not merely a new coastline, it was a new world teeming with a life and potential that must have seemed almost mythical to people living on the Arctic edge of survival. Leif and his crew built temporary shelters, what the sagas call booths, and overwintered in this abundant land. They explored, they marveled, and they loaded their ship with a prize cargo of timber and grapes. Their return to Greenland was the stuff of saga triumph, a story of discovery and riches that would ignite the ambitions of others. The following years saw successive voyages, most notably one led by Leif's brother, Thorvald Erikson. It was Thorvald's expedition that would irrevocably change the nature of the Vinland venture, transforming it from an exploratory mission into a tense and ultimately violent encounter. Thorvald and his men used Leif's camp as a base, and during a reconnaissance of the surrounding fjords and inlets, they made a discovery that would have chilled their blood despite their warrior ethos. On a sandy beach, they came upon 3 strange boats, upturned on the shore, and beneath each boat, 3 sleeping figures. These were not Norse. The sagas give them a name that would echo through the centuries, a label born of Norse perception and prejudice. Skrælings, a term used in Greenland for the indigenous Dorset and Thule peoples, likely meant wretches or screechers, a word laden with a sense of otherness and inferiority. In that moment of stunned discovery on a Vinland beach, 2 human universes, having evolved on opposite sides of the planetary Atlantic for millennia, stood on the precipice of meeting. What happened next was not a meeting, but a slaughter. That narrative, preserved in the Icelandic sagas centuries later, is stark and unflinching, startled and, by their own cultural logic, perceiving a potential threat. The Norsemen did not attempt communication or observe from a distance. They attacked. 8 of the 9 sleeping figures were killed where they lay. Only one escaped, fleeing into the trees. A Norse, perhaps already sensing the profound wrongness of their action or seeking to justify it, examined the bodies of the dead with a cold, analytical curiosity. They noted their physical appearance described as small and dark in their technology, the hide boats and tools. To the Vikings, warriors from a culture where preemptive violence was often a survival strategy, this may have seemed a prudent elimination of unknown adversaries, but in the grand, tragic arc of first contacts, it was a catastrophic opening act, a declaration of hostility written in blood on a foreign shore. The violence was not born of a specific grievance, but of a deep, ingrained fear of the unknown, a fear that would now be reciprocated and magnified. The retaliation was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Thorvald and his crew, now alert to the presence of others in this land they sought to claim, continued their explorations. Later that same summer, while camped along a wooded promontory, they were met by a sight that would have been both awe-inspiring and terrifying. From the mouth of a nearby fjord, a multitude of hide boats, Karfi, appeared, swarming toward them like a flotilla of water insects. This was no small family group. It was a concerted response from the people whose kinsmen had been murdered. The sagas describe the scene with a palpable tension. The Norse, heavily outnumbered, watching as the shoreline filled with these strange, small vessels. The people in the boats, the Skrælings, did not immediately attack. They exhibited a profound and unsettling curiosity, staring at the Norsemen and their ships, their alien forms and technology, from a safe distance. For a time, there was only this silent, mutual observation across the water, a fragile moment where something other than violence might have been possible. That fragility shattered when the Norsemen's own fear overcame them. Feeling surrounded and vulnerable, they did what their martial culture dictated. They formed a shield wall, a moving fortress of wood and iron. On the beach, this display of organized, metallic aggression, the sun glinting off their helmets and spear points, was likely as alien and terrifying to the indigenous observers as the hide boats were to the Norse. The reaction was decisive. The people in the boats began to shout, a sound the saga author interprets as fear, and they retreated to the head of the bay. But this was not a flight, it was a regrouping. The violence, when it came, was swift. Arrows, likely tipped with stone or bone, rained down upon the Norse position from the trees. The Norse, clad in mail and protected by their shields, found their defenses tested by an unfamiliar form of warfare. In the confusion of this skirmish, a leader emerged. Thorvald Erikson, rallying his men, was struck by an arrow that passed between the side of the ship and his shield, finding a fatal gap in his armor. As he lay dying, he is said to have uttered a grim, fatalistic joke, asking his men to bury him on the headland with a cross at his head and his feet, and to call the place Crossenus. His death was a profound shock. He was not a lowly crewman, but a son of Erik the Red, a chieftain of high status. His fall signaled that this new land was not an empty paradise to be claimed, but a place already powerfully defended by people who were skilled, organized, and unafraid to fight for their home. The Norse burial party did as he asked, interring him in the land he had sought to colonize, a solitary Norse grave, marking the first major casualty of a transatlantic conflict. His crew, their purpose shattered, returned to Leif's camp and then to Greenland, carrying with them a new and sobering report of Vinland, a land of bounty, yes, but also a land of death. The story of Vinland, however, did not end with Thorvald's arrow-pierced body on that headland. The promise of resources, especially timber, a commodity desperately scarce in Greenland, was too great to abandon. The next major expedition was one of settlement, not mere exploration. It was led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelandic merchant of considerable means and ambition, who arrived in Vinland with a fleet of ships carrying not just warriors, but women, livestock, and the full apparatus for establishing a permanent colony. This was the Norse dream made manifest, to transplant their society, their families, and their way of life onto these fertile shores. They built their longhouses near a sheltered inlet, perhaps in the area now known as Meadows in Newfoundland, and for a time, the saga describes a period of relative peace and even wonder. The colony's population grew with the birth of a child, Snorri, the first documented European birth in the Americas. The settlers traded with the indigenous people who came to visit. The Norse offered strips of red cloth in exchange for pelts and furs. The cloth, a vibrant novelty, was particularly sought after, and for a season, a fragile, silent barter economy operated on the beach. It was a transaction without shared language, a commerce of gestures and mutually understood desires, a thin thread of connection spun between two worlds. But this thread was destined to snap. The inherent tensions of this situation were too profound. The Norse worldview, shaped by their pastoral and acquisitive culture, saw land and resources as commodities to be claimed and controlled. The indigenous peoples of the region, likely ancestors of the Bathik or related Algonquian groups, lived within a different cosmological framework, one of complex kinship with the land and its creatures. The growing Norse settlement, their free grazing cattle trampling vegetation, and their very presence as a fixed, alien community represented a fundamental disruption. The sagas pinpoint the catalyst for violence to a very specific and culturally symbolic moment, the death of a Norse bull. The animal, brought from Greenland, broke from its pen and bellowed loudly, terrifying the Skrælings who were visiting the settlement. This was not merely a frightened reaction to a strange animal. Within many indigenous belief systems, powerful animal spirits were central to the natural order. The sudden, roaring appearance of this enormous, unfamiliar creature could have been interpreted as a terrible omen, or a manifestation of hostile spiritual power. The visitors fled. When they returned, it was not for trade. They came in anger and in force. What followed was not a battle but a siege, a desperate fight for the survival of the Norse colony. A great number of indigenous warriors, the sagas claim, attacked the settlement from the woods, using slings to hurl a terrifying new weapon, a large, dark ball that made a frightening noise when it landed and emitted a foul stench. Scholars have long debated the nature of this weapon. Some suggest it could have been a pouch of burning animal fat or pitch, an early form of incendiary or psychological warfare. On Norse, under Karlsefni's leadership, were forced into a defensive crouch. They retreated behind their palisades, and in a moment of desperation, it was a pregnant, Freyd's Erikson, the formidable sister of Leif and Thorvald, who, according to the saga, seized the psychological initiative. Seeing her countrymen falter, she snatched up a sword from a fallen man, bared her breast, and slapped it with the flat of the blade, screaming a fierce challenge. This shocking act, so contrary to Norse norms of female behavior, allegedly stunned the attackers and spurred the Norsemen to rally, driving the assault back. While the historicity of this specific event is debated, its inclusion in the saga speaks to the extremity of the colony's peril. The attack was repelled, but the message was clear. The land was not empty, and its people would not tolerate this foreign enclave. Their resistance was effective, organized, and spiritually charged. The colony, though it had survived the assault, was mortally wounded in spirit. The dream of Vinland as a peaceful, expanding settlement was extinguished. The constant state of vigilance required, the psychological toll of being surrounded by a vast, unfamiliar land and a justifiably hostile population, eroded the settlers' resolve. Thorfinn Karlsefni, a pragmatist, made the decision that would define the Norse experience in the New World. After 2 more winters, he ordered the ships reloaded with all the timber, coats, and grapevines they could carry, and he led the entire colony back across the Atlantic to Greenland. The longhouses at Leifspear, or whatever they named their settlement, fell silent. The hearths grew cold. The Norse had come to Vinland with the full intention of staying, of weaving their own story into the landscape. They left behind the graves of their dead, like Thorvald, and the archaeological detritus of their attempt, iron nails, a bronze pin, the unmistakable outline of sod-wall buildings that would only be rediscovered a millennium later. But they did not leave behind a lasting legacy of presence. Their venture, for all its daring, ended not with a conquest but with a retreat. The sagas summarize the reasoning with stark clarity. Despite the land's goodness, they concluded that they would always live there, under the threat of attack from its prior inhabitants. The cost of permanence was a war they were neither equipped nor willing to win. Later, sporadic voyages from Greenland to the Markland coast continued for centuries. Driven purely by necessity, these were not missions of conquest or settlement, but desperate logging expeditions. Greenland, a society perched on the edge of the inhabitable world, lacked the one resource fundamental to a Norse existence: wood. for ship repair, for building, for warmth beyond precious peat. They needed timber, and so crews would make the dangerous crossing to the forested shores of Labrador to cut what they needed and return as quickly as possible. These journeys were undertaken with extreme caution, likely avoiding contact at all costs. The memory of the Skrælings arrows and the siege at Karlsefni settlement had hardened into a cultural truth. The sagas, written down in Iceland in the 13th and 14th centuries, preserve this truth in amber. In them, the indigenous peoples of North America are not fleshed-out characters, but narrative for sometimes curious traders, more often terrifying attackers. Always the fundamental reason. The lush promise of Vinland remained forever out of reach. They became the monstrous inhabitants at the edge of the map. The reason a land of such abundance was left to its original owners. The final, chilling postscript to this forgotten war comes not from the sagas, but from the silent witness of archaeology and climate. As the Little Ice Age tightened its grip on the North Atlantic in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Greenland Norse settlements themselves began to fail. The seas became more treacherous, the summer shorter, the connection to Iceland and Norway more tenuous. In their increasing isolation, the Greenlanders may have looked west one last time, not with ambition, but with a deeper, more visceral fear. The last documented voyage to Markland occurred in 1347, when a Greenlandic ship bound for the timber grounds was blown off course and ended up in Iceland. By the end of the 15th century, the Norse settlements in Greenland were extinct, victims of a changing climate, economic collapse, and possibly conflict with the expanding Thule culture. The ancestors of the Inuit, with their demise, even the memory of the land across the water faded in Europe. When Christopher Columbus sailed in 1492, he was venturing into a world that, for Europeans, was genuinely new. The Norse experience, a tantalizing and violent prelude, had vanished into the realm of semi-mythical saga, a whispered story of a green land far to the west that was too dangerous to keep. The modern rediscovery of this first contact began not with a dramatic excavation, but with the patient, meticulous work of interpreting old texts and reading the landscape itself. For centuries, the Vinland sagas were considered fascinating legends, epic tales of daring but ultimately fictional voyages. The turning point came in the 1960s, when Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Stein Ingstad, following a careful analysis of the saga descriptions, turned their attention to the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, at a place called Meadows. Local tradition pointed them to overgrown, grassy mounds that did not look natural to a trained eye. What they uncovered over subsequent excavation seasons was nothing short of revolutionary. The unmistakable footprint of a Norse settlement. They found the foundations of 8 turf wall buildings, identical in construction to those found in Iceland and Greenland, including a longhouse, a smithy, and various workshops. The artifacts were few but unequivocal: a bronze cloak pin of Norse design, a stone oil lamp, iron nails, and slag from iron working technology, unknown to the indigenous peoples of the region at that time. Most tellingly, radiocarbon dating placed the site around the year 1000 AD. This was not a seasonal camp of later Basque fishermen or some unknown group. It was Leif Erikson's life spear, or a settlement very much like it. Archaeology had proven the sagas true. Meadows was the first and only confirmed Norse site in North America, a silent, windswept testament to the reality of the Viking presence. But if Meadows confirms the Norse arrival, it also frames the profound brevity and ultimate failure of their project. The site was not a town, but a base for exploration and overwintering. The archaeological layer is thin, the evidence of occupation lasting perhaps a decade at most. There are no signs of prolonged, generations-long habitation, no expanding farmsteads, no cemetery. The settlement was used, and then it was completely and deliberately abandoned. The Norse took everything of value with them when they left. This pattern of short-term use and orderly departure fits precisely with the saga narrative of a bold venture ultimately scuttled by the pressures of a hostile environment and the resistance of its inhabitants. The physical evidence on the ground tells a story of a bridgehead established and then relinquished, a doorway to a continent opened and then deliberately closed. It speaks to a conscious decision that the rewards, however rich, did not outweigh the existential risks. The legacy of this violent first contact is therefore a paradoxical one, etched more in absence than in presence. Unlike the later European colonizations, the Norse left no lasting genetic imprint on the indigenous populations of the northeastern seaboard, no epidemic diseases that raced ahead of them, no permanent place names that stuck, no enduring trade routes. Their sojourn was a historical ephemeron, a ripple that briefly crossed the Atlantic before dissipating. For the indigenous peoples involved, the encounters with this strange, pale, metal-clad arrivals in their hide boats must have entered oral tradition as a bizarre and frightening episode, a warning of dangerous strangers from across the eastern water. But without a sustained Norse presence to reinforce the memory, it likely faded or transformed into myth over the centuries. The true, enduring impact is in the realm of historical understanding. The meeting at Vinland stands as a pure, isolated case study of first contact, uncomplicated by the world-altering consequences that would follow Columbus's voyages. It shows us that such meetings are not inherently destined for conquest or subjugation. They are fraught with mutual fear, tragic misunderstanding, and the potential for catastrophic violence. And the outcome is determined not by destiny, but by a fragile balance of power, will, and environmental circumstance. The Norse, for all their martial prowess and seafaring genius, met a force they could not overcome, a people deeply connected to their homeland and willing to defend it. In the end, the forgotten war for Vinland was won decisively by those who were already there. To understand the full weight of this failure, one must look east from Vinland, back across the ocean to the Norse world that spun these explorers. The Viking Age was, at its heart, an age of mobility and opportunism, driven by a combination of land hunger, trade ambition, and a culture that celebrated overseas adventure. The settlements in Iceland and Greenland represented the extreme edges of this expansion, societies that balanced on a knife's edge of sustainability. Greenland, in particular, was a marginal proposition from the start. The eastern and western settlements clung to fjords, where a subarctic pastoralism was just possible. Their economy built on a fragile triad of livestock, seal hunting, and the export of prestige goods, like Walrus ivory and narwhal tusks to Europe. Vinland, in the sagas, was portrayed as the solution to their limitations, a land of limitless timber and temperate pastures. Its loss was therefore not just a tactical retreat, but a strategic catastrophe for the Greenlandic Norse. It condemned them to a perpetual scarcity, locking them into a dependence on irregular supply ships from Europe and their own dwindling local resources. The memory of Vinland's bounty, just over the horizon but forever out of reach, must have haunted them as their own world began to contract with the changing climate. The contrast between the Norse experience in Vinland and their earlier expansions is stark and instructive. When they settled Iceland in the 9th century, they found an island that, while challenging, was essentially uninhabited save for a few Irish monks who offered no resistance. They could impose their social order, their land system of claiming territory, directly onto the landscape. In Greenland, they encountered the Dorset culture, a people who were likely displaced or who interacted minimally with the newcomers. In the more hospitable fjords, the Norse desired, but in Vinland, they came up against a numerous, settled, and technologically adaptable people who were already fully integrated into the ecosystem the Norse coveted. The indigenous peoples of the Newfoundland and Gulf of St. Lawrence region were not nomadic hunter-gatherers in a simplistic sense. They were sophisticated practitioners of seasonal rounds, with established territories, complex social structures, and effective weaponry. They were, crucially, capable of mounting a coordinated and sustained military response. The Norse, for perhaps the first time in their expansion, faced an indigenous population that could not be displaced, intimidated, or ignored. Their usual strategies of establishing a fortified beachhead and gradually expanding their control failed utterly in the face of this resilient opposition. The term Skrælings itself which the Norse used as a catch-all for the peoples of North America, is a linguistic relic of this failure to understand or engage. It was a label of dismissal, a way of categorizing a diverse humanity as a monolithic, less or other. By not learning the names these people called themselves, by not comprehending their social or political structures, the Norse ensured that their relationship would remain one of mere transaction or conflict. There was no diplomacy in the saga accounts, no attempt at alliance, no exchange of hostages or interpreters practices known in the Viking world. From their interactions with the complex societies of Francia, Britain, and the Byzantine Empire, in Vinland, the interaction remained at its most primitive level, curiosity, followed by trade, escalating swiftly to skirmish and siege. This breakdown in the very possibility of communication underscores the profound isolation of the Norse venture. They were not backed by a king or a church. They were a privately organized group, thousands of miles from any reinforcement, attempting to face a continent with the resources of a single longship or a small fleet. When the situation became untenable, there was no empire to call upon, only the long, dangerous voyage home. Thus, the story of Vikings meeting Native Americans is not a prologue to the later history of colonization. It is a separate, closed loop. It demonstrates a historical road not taken. It shows that European arrival in the Americas did not have to result in catastrophic demographic collapse and wholesale cultural subjugation. That later tragedy required specific, world-altering ingredients absent in the 11th century. The virulent pathogens of the Old World that had become endemic in its dense populations, the driving force of competing monarchies seeking global empires, and the ideological engine of militant Christianity. The Norse had none of these. They came with their own diseases, but not the devastating pandemics that would follow Columbus. They came for timber and pasture, not for gold or souls. And when they were met with determined resistance, they left. The forgotten war was, in the end, a war that ended with a withdrawal. The continent remained, for another 5 centuries, in the hands of its original nations. The Norse departure from Vinland left the deep, silent forests of Markland and the gentle inlets of the northern coast to the rhythms of the people who knew them best, the echo of their encounter fading into the wind that still sweeps across the beaches at El and Sol Meadows, where the outlines of sod walls remain, not as a monument to conquest, but as a ghostly imprint of a possibility that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. The final, lingering question is not why the Norse left, but why they never returned in force. The Greenland settlements persisted for centuries after Karlsefni's retreat, and the need for Vinland's timber only grew more acute as the Little Ice Age advanced. The knowledge of the route was preserved, as shown by the 1347 voyage to Markland. Yet no second serious colonization attempt was ever launched. The answer lies in a slow, compounding calculus of cost and risk that ultimately rendered Vinland not just dangerous, but obsolete. For the Greenland Norse, life became a relentless struggle against a deteriorating environment. Sea ice increased, making the already perilous voyage to Markland, let alone Vinland, a gamble with higher stakes. Their society turned inward, conservative, and focused on sheer survival. The ambitious, exploratory spirit of the Viking Age had faded, replaced by a defensive isolation. The manpower and resources required to mount a military expedition capable of seizing and holding a territory in Vinland simply no longer existed. In the dwindling, struggling communities of Greenland, they became prisoners of their own marginal environment, looking west with longing but without the means to act. Furthermore, the European market that had once driven Greenland's economy shifted. Walrus ivory, the colony's chief export, was gradually supplanted by elephant ivory, arriving via expanding Mediterranean and African trade routes. Greenland's connection to the European economic sphere weakened, leaving it even more isolated and impoverished. The dream of Vinland as a source of wealth and expansion lost its relevance in a world where Greenland itself was fading from Europe's consciousness. By the time the Eastern settlement went silent in the mid-15th century, the very memory of lands across the Western Ocean had likely receded into the realm of half-remembered family stories, material for sagas told around winter fires in Iceland, but not a practical destination. The doorway had closed not with a bang, but with a slow, silent accumulation of snow on an abandoned longhouse roof in Greenland. In the grand narrative of human history, the Norse venture to North America is a profound and haunting footnote. It represents a fleeting intersection of two human trajectories that had diverged millennia before. During the last ice age, for a few short years, perhaps a generation, those trajectories converged on the fog-shrouded coast of Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The convergence was marked by wonder, by the silent exchange of goods on a beach, and then, inevitably it seems, by fear, violence, and death. It was a first contact in its purest, most elemental form, two worlds meeting with no possibility of comprehending the other, each interpreting the other through a lens of their own fears, desires, and cultural certainties. The Norse saw a land ripe for taking and people they deemed savages obstructing their claim. The indigenous people saw dangerous, alien invaders with strange powers and aggressive instincts, a threat to their home that had to be repelled. Both were right from their own perspective. There was no common ground upon which to build anything lasting, only a narrow strip of contested shore. Today, Meadows is a northeast World Heritage Site, a place of windswept grass and reconstructed sod huts where visitors can stand and look out across the same waters the Norse longships once crossed. It is a place of deep quiet where the past feels very close, but the true significance of the site lies not in the Norse artifacts found there, but in its testimony to a road not taken. It is a monument to historical contingency. It proves that the European discovery of America was not a single, inevitable event in 1492, but a process that could have unfolded in vastly different ways at different times. The Norse failure shows that conquest was not a foregone conclusion. It required a specific alignment of technological, biological, and ideological forces that would not converge for another 500 years. The story of the Vikings and the Skrælings is thus a dark, forgotten mirror to the later history of the Americas. It is a story of what happened when a would-be colonizing force met a resilient people on something like equal terms and was turned back. In the end, the forgotten war was won not by the side with the iron weapons and the ocean-crossing ships, but by the side that knew the land, that fought for their home without the possibility of retreat, and that simply, definitively, outlasted the strangers from the sea. The echoes of this brief, violent meeting resonate in subtle and surprising ways, far beyond the archaeological site and the saga texts. They exist in the realm of cultural memory and scientific discovery, hinting at a past that was more interconnected than the simple narrative of abandonment might suggest. Recent genomic studies of Icelandic populations have revealed a faint but persistent genetic signal, a small percentage of DNA that originates not from Europe or the British Isles, but from a source akin to the indigenous populations of the Americas. While the exact pathway of this genetic material remains debated, one compelling theory points to a woman, likely from the northeastern coastal regions of America, who was brought back to Iceland, perhaps in the early 11th century. Her story is lost, her name unknown, but her genetic legacy suggests a captive taken during the conflicts in Vinland or Markland, a silent, living souvenir of that first contact, who survived the return voyage and had children in a new land. She represents the human cost, often omitted from the grand tales of exploration, a personal thread woven from the violent tapestry of the forgotten war, binding the continents together in a way that would not be seen again for centuries. Furthermore, the environmental record, read through ice cores and pollen samples, offers a macro-scale backdrop to the human drama. The Norse arrival in Greenland and their attempted push into Vinland occurred during the medieval warm period, a climatic anomaly that made the North Atlantic marginally more navigable and Greenland somewhat more hospitable. Their retreat and ultimate disappearance from the hemisphere coincided with the onset of the Little Ice Age. This is not to say climate alone determined their fate, but it framed it. The window of opportunity for a transatlantic Norse colony was historically narrow, opened by a warm climate and slammed shut by a cooling one. Within that brief window, they had to establish a self-sustaining bridgehead against determined opposition. They failed, The story of Vinland is thus a powerful case study in the intersection of human ambition and environmental constraint. A reminder that history unfolds not on a static stage, but on one that is constantly shifting, often in ways the actors themselves cannot perceive. The enduring power of the Vinland story, then, lies in its layers of tragedy and its invitation to reflection. It is a tragedy for the Norse, who glimpsed a solution to their existential scarcities, only to see it vanish behind a cloud of arrows and a wall of incomprehension. It is a tragedy, the one of resistance and survival, for the indigenous peoples, whose peaceful territory was invaded without provocation, who lost kinsmen to a sudden, inexplicable attack on a beach, and who were forced to mobilize for a war they did not seek. But most of all, it is a testament to the fragility of such moments of contact. The Norse and the Native Americans met as absolute strangers, with no shared language, no shared cosmology, no framework for negotiation beyond the basic calculus of force. In such a vacuum, the default human response to suspicion, fear, and preemptive violence took hold with grim predictability. The sagas, for all their Norse-centric perspective, capture this perfectly. The initial curiosity, the tentative trade, the catastrophic misunderstanding, and the escalation to total conflict. It is a pattern that would repeat, with far more devastating consequences, all across the Americas after 1492. Standing today at El Anso Meadows, one feels the weight of this layered history. The reconstructed longhouses are neat and informative, but the true atmosphere is outside them. In the vast, open landscape of sea and sky, the low hills and boggy ground, it is a place that feels both intimate and immense. You can almost see the hide boats rounding the headland, the Norse scrambling to form their shield wall on the beach. You can sense the absolute alienness each group must have felt for the other. This was not a meeting of civilizations in the grand sense. It was a collision of small, specific groups of people on the very edge of their respective worlds. Its historical significance is immense, yet its physical footprint is vanishingly small. The Forgotten War left few scars on the land, but it etched a profound lesson into the historical record that the course of history is not linear, that conquest is not inevitable, and that the outcomes of first contact are written in the delicate, often tragic interplay of environment, culture, and the unpredictable human heart. The wind that blows across the side is the same that filled the sails of Leif Erikson's ship and that carried the shouts of the Skrælings across the water. It is a wind that has forgotten nothing, whispering a story of ambition, fear, and a continent that, for a little while longer, remained its own.